today's episode, we are not talking about trust as something you can demand, design, or assume. We are talking about trust as something fragile, something that only exists when people feel heard, taken seriously, and given real influence. My guest today is Ruben Beijl. He argues that we often talk about a lack of trust as if it were bad weather, something that just happens to us. But trust, he says, doesn't disappear by accident. It erodes when participation is symbolic, when voices don't matter, and when responsibility is never truly shared. Ruben works with citizens' assemblies and participatory processes, where ordinary citizens are invited to help shape public decisions. In our conversation, we explore trust as a practice rather than a principle. Why disagreement doesn't destroy trust, but being ignored does. And why handling over responsibility may be the hardest and most needed step institutions can take. Ruben, welcome to TrustTalk. In your book, Tijd, voor Vertrouwen in Dutch, or Time, for Trust, you argue that we often treat trust as something that should already exist, while in reality it is something that has to be actively built. Why do you think we keep making that mistake?
So I think we romanticize trust. We treat it as something that should simply be there as a given rather than a task. But trust is relational and it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It emerges through interaction, through consistent behavior, through being seen and heard. And the mistake is that we expect trust without doing the work. So we say there is a lack of trust as if it's a weather condition that we can't influence, but trust requires conscious effort every single day. And we quote marketing expert Rory Sutherland in the book. He says, trust grows slowly like a coconut tree, yet it falls like the speed of a coconut.
I like that one. You write that trust is not naive optimism, but a fragile social mechanism that can disappear very quickly. From your experience, what makes trust so easy to lose and so hard to rebuild?
Real trust is built on vulnerability. So when you trust someone, you give them space to act, expecting they will do what matters to you, even when you can't control them. And that vulnerability is why trust is so fragile. So if you make one careless decision or you withheld one piece of information, the foundation of that trust cracks. And rebuilding it requires more than an explanation of what your intentions are or the good intentions themselves. What counts is what the other person felt after your interaction. And only through consistent behavior, genuine attention, and the willingness to listen without defending yourself, which is a big one, trust can slowly return.
In your book, you write about what in Dutch are called burgerberaden, or in English, citizen assemblies. For people who don't know this term, what are they and how are they meant to build trust?
So in the book, we quote the definition from the Association of Dutch Municipalities and the Ministry of the Interior from the Netherlands. And the definition we give is a citizens' assembly is a randomly selected group of approximately 100 people who convene for a minimum of about 5 sessions to advise policymakers on a societal issue. Dialogue and deliberation among participants is the central point, based on a comprehensive information. The assembly is supported by experts and facilitators like me, and the participant group is composed through weighted sortition, with the citizens' assembly reflecting the broader population. And the participant group operates independently of politicians and other stakeholders. So that's the definition we give in our book. And so this is the definition we give to understand what's exactly being meant by beraden or a citizens' assembly. And the whole book is an exploration of this central question. So how do they build trust? Not just by checking the boxes, but we have a whole model where we dive deep in what's happening there. Because when we started writing the book, we saw the potential of burgerberaden, but we also saw how it wasn't guaranteed. Trust wasn't a guaranteed outcome of those assemblies. But we tried to distill the biggest insights that led to the trust build. And part of it is the inclusion of the people you let participate in such an intensive cooperation between the government and the citizens. But it's also the attention and time taken to build a foundation of psychological safety. And that's a very important one.
You say in the book that trust in groups cannot exist without psychological safety, you just mentioned. The feeling that people can speak without fear or being judged or even attacked. So in citizen assemblies, how do you recognize when that safety is actually present?
Yeah, so the main point, because I facilitate those kinds of conversations, and the main indicator for the psychological safety being present is that people are saying what they really mean, and they are not hiding something, and they feel and connect with each other. And that's a tangible thing. It's not just something that's theoretical, but you can sense when people are connecting because they do not consent with each other mainly, but because they are listening attentively to each other and they feel comfortable enough to disagree with each other.
Yeah, a follow-up on what you just said. Can you think of a citizen assembly where things look good on paper, but in the room people didn't feel safe to speak?
Yeah. There's a section in the book we also talk about the influence of external observers who are not participating. And midway through an assembly, we've allowed a few of those external observers to attend. Those are policy officers who wanted to see how it worked. And on paper, this was harmless, even desirable for the institutional buy-in. But afterwards, several participants told us they had held back during that session. And one said, I didn't want to say something stupid in front of these officials. And another said she had stopped herself from sharing a personal story because the observers were polite and silent, but their presence, that changed the room. They were taking notes. They were there, even though they didn't participate in it. So the safety wasn't formally breached. There were no interruptions. There were no judgments. But the participants felt watched, and that was enough to break that psychological safety.
One of your strongest claims is that people do not lose trust because they disagree, but because their input turns out not to matter. Why is meaningful influence more important than agreement?
Well, because people can accept decisions they disagree with as long as they believe the process was fair and their voice genuinely mattered. And what destroys this trust is not the disagreement, but it's the experience of being invited to speak and then being ignored. And people get the sense that everything was already decided before they were allowed to contribute. And that's when frustration and eroding trust set in.
You also argue that participation often fails because it comes too late, when the key decisions have already been made. Why is timing so crucial for trust?
Well, too often participation comes at a moment when the playing field is already full of agreements and budgets and frameworks. And even when intentions are genuine, there is a friction because the people invest time and energy and then there's silence. And their input disappears into coordination and prioritization. And in both cases, it's mostly too late or there's no follow-up. And the effect is the same. The frustration and the trust seeps away because people want their contribution to have meaning and not just because they want to have their way. They understand that it's not always possible to have their way.
In the book, you make a clear distinction between being informed and having influence. Why is information alone not enough to sustain trust?
Yeah, so the definition from the VNG we already gave, it centers on influence and not just information because informing is necessary. It's a big part of trust because of transparency and other reasons. But it's not participation in itself. If you only inform people, you're essentially broadcasting. So you're sending and you're not listening exactly. And that's not inherently wrong, but it creates friction when people expect something different. An information evening with a microphone or a presentation and rows of chairs, that's the standard way of participating, or has been the standard way of participation in the Netherlands for a long time. It has the good intention, but the moment someone stands up and shouts that they're not being listened to it's already hanging in the air.
You write that trust grows through, in Dutch word, vertrouwen. I don't know how to translate that into English, but by actually handing over responsibility before knowing the outcome. Why is that so difficult for governments?
It feels very risky for politicians who carry the load of political responsibility. And there's always the temptation to make policy just in case or think a scenario scenarios. But a citizens' assembly requires policy delay. So you need to be willing to wait until the advice is in before acting. And that's counterintuitive for governments who are accustomed to planning ahead. But yet the yield of giving trust is far greater than what a distrust delivers. And trusting citizens is not a leap into darkness or something. It's a choice for a different kind of legitimacy. It's based on involvement and shared responsibility. And that's new for most politicians to do. So they do not know exactly what they can expect. And that's a risk to take.
In citizen assemblies, politicians are asked to accept advice that may conflict with their party programs. How can they do that without losing political credibility?
Yes, so this is a big dilemma because the politicians are elected on their manifestos, their ideals and their promises. And what if citizen assembly produces proposals that clash with their party line? So it's all about how they frame their role. So you can disagree with starting an assembly and vote against it, but once it's democratically decided and the mandate is set, you need to be loyal to the process and you support the rules of the game, even if you would have preferred something else. That's what we call democratic maturity, really believing in those core democratic principles and setting your ego aside a little bit.
Is it fair to say that many institutions want citizens' opinions, but not their power?
Yeah, I think that's often true because it's a fundamental choice. You need to trust or you distrust. And if you are not entrusting a societal question to a citizens' assembly because a need of control or you fear losing faith, it may bring short-term political peace, but in the long run, distrust undermines both the quality of the democracy and the effectiveness of policy. So entrusting a question to citizens is much more than a tool for good advice. It's more a choice that touches the core of human dignity in society. Perhaps the real question is, can you truly represent the people if you don't give them your trust?
Another subject. In your book, you also distinguish between three kinds of trust. Cognitive trust, so the competence and reliability. Emotional trust, like being seen as a human. And institutional trust, faith in the system. Which of these is most neglected in modern governance?
The emotional trust is most often overlooked. So there may be a solid process, architecture, tight planning, proper information provision, but there's no warm, genuine relationship often. And without that foundation, participation remains empty, meaningless. And people don't just want to be involved, they want to be recognized. So that's the soil, we call it the fruitful soil in the book, where emotional trust can grow. And you cannot fake that. People can see right through performed concern. They feel when it's staged. And it takes real attention, vulnerability, and a willingness to be a human yourself rather than to hide behind your title or function.
Yeah. Which of the three is the hardest to repair once it has been damaged?
The hardest to repair is the institutional trust because it's shaped by accumulated experiences over a long time, mostly. In the Netherlands, we all know the stories of the childcare benefits scandal and the Groningen earthquake damage Beijl. But our national ombudsman, the nationale ombudsman, says the government will never be flawless. And where things go wrong, citizens may expect acknowledgement and repair. And it's not about being perfect, but it's about how you respond when you failed. And one experience of arbitrariness or discrimination or bureaucratic coldness can be enough to shake that foundation. It's very easy to break that trust and very hard to rebuild it.
You warn that when participation is offered only symbolically, it destroys more trust than not involving people at all. How can citizens usually tell when participation is not genuine?
Well, people feel it immediately. We see that over and over. So when participation is suggested but not really possible, it feels like some kind of a rubber stamp, just a formality. And people sense that decisions were already made. And sometimes they don't even hear back after investing a lot of their time, a lot of their free time, sometimes 5 weekend days or something like that. In non-response research for one of our assemblies, someone literally said, I can't have a bad experience if I don't go. That's sometimes the mentality people have. And that tells everything about how previous symbolic participation has damaged those expectations. And the only remedy is radical honesty about what's actually on the table.
Well, what is the biggest difference between a participatory process that feels real and one that feels staged?
Yeah, so a real process has genuine policy space. We call it beleidsruimte in Dutch. You put down the pen before you know what citizens will write. And that's a big one. So you don't present a choice menu, but you let people name what they find important. A staged process, by contrast, has implicit preference baked in. And the document looks neutral, but was written by policymakers who've worked on the issue for years. And the speakers are experts, but sometimes also stakeholders. So the questions are open formally, but the options were pre-selected. And that's framing disguised as informing. And real processes help people orient themselves. And the stage ones try to convince them of something.
Many people today are skeptical and say, trust sounds nice, but politics will always disappoint. Based on what you have seen in practice, what would you say to them?
I understand. I really understand that skepticism. I've had it myself as well. And it's often historically formed by failures of public services. But I've seen what happens when the conditions are right. So, for example, in Drenthe, provincie Drenthe, province, the sense that groups stand diametrically opposed on housing issues dropped significantly after the assembly. And in Groningen, perceived polarization decreased. That was scientifically proven. And in Zutphen, a participant gave an emotional speech to the city council about how the group had given him faith in society again. So that's really something. People are willing to step over the shadows, and trust can grow even where it seemed lost. That's what we see over and over.
Okay, I didn't quite get what happened in Zutphen. Can you explain what happened in Zutphen?
So in Zutphen, there was a citizens' assembly about the energy transition, and the government didn't inform about a really impactful decision to make AZC, or a dienstencentrum, so a place for refugees to come. And that was during that citizens' assembly, and people were taken aback by that. And they didn't trust the government from that point. And from the 100 plus people, 30 or 40 didn't show up again the next time, just because that decision by the government in a whole another process.
If governments want to rebuild trust, what is the one thing they should stop doing and the one thing they should start doing?
Yeah, so they should stop treating participation as a checkbox exercise, or inviting people when decisions are already made, and then disappearing into silence, which is sadly how it mostly went historically. And that creates more damage than not involving people at all. So what they should start doing is actually entrust questions to citizens, real big important questions, with a clear mandate. That's a really important one. Genuine policy space and visible follow-through. That's also something that's often overlooked. And not asking how do citizens fit into our policy process, but how does our policy process fit what citizens need, really. So trust is a two-way contract in that sense. And it's a parallel movement that we describe, and that requires governments to move from control to space, and citizens need to move from waiting, sitting back, to taking ownership. And both movements, they need to happen simultaneously.
Ruben, we approaching the end of our conversation. Thank you very much for your insights. A question, how's the book doing?
Yeah, it's doing well. So we really try to get it into the hands of the people who need to read it, and not just hoping that it sells a lot of books to the big public. So, for example, we sent a copy to every municipality in the Netherlands, so that they really, the people who need to hear it are impacted by it, and not because we wait until everyone has read it. So we try to do that proactively, and the reactions are very good. And the first official reviews we got, they are very positive, and people are really doing something with it, not just reading it and then say that's a nice book, but also practically taking it back to their job and municipality, for example. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ruben, for being available. Wish you all the best with your book and your projects. And again, thanks for being our guest.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to TrustTalk. Trust is easy to praise, much harder to understand. That's what these conversations are for. Hope to see you back for the next conversation.